All right. Good morning or good afternoon, I guess, to everybody. I'm happy to introduce a few fellas that are going to be talking today about soil erosion and some, I guess, different irrigation rotations to reduce the risk of soil erosion. So we have Rob Dunn. Rob Dunn's a cropping system specialist from FarmWise Inc., and he's going to talk to us about soil structure and reducing erosion risks. As well as we have Dr. Frank Larney, who's a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, which I understand is a little bit almost retired, which is good for Frank, but maybe not for the soils industry. So Frank's going to talk to us about lessons learned in the Vauxhall irrigation rotation study. So anyways, without further ado, Rob, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen, and we're happy to listen.
Okay, thanks very much, Todd, and I'll see if that did that share for us.
Yeah, you bet. That worked perfect.
Okay, you're good then. So So when Todd had approached me earlier this year, we were kind of talking about a little bit about this issue of wind erosion, and it's certainly been, I think a little bit worse this last couple of winters, and perhaps, and we'll maybe talk a little bit about maybe some of the reasons why. Down through that, and I don't get up to the Brooks area as often as I should. Spent a bit more time when I was working with Alberta Agriculture up until 2014. But these would be some shots closer to Lethbridge, kind of in that Tabor area last spring. And again, you can see, we've been out in the field with trying to rough it up in the late winter, early spring, just to stop the erosion that was happening. Of course, anytime we see wind erosion happening, we used to kind of use as a rule of thumb that we're probably losing as much as 5 tons per acre, which we would kind of consider that 5 ton per acre as something around the amount of that would be the genesis of soil would be about 5 tons per acre per year, and it's about the thickness of a dime. And when we start losing more soil than that, obviously we're just we're losing ground, and we can't afford to do that, obviously. And that's the reason for some of the work that Todd's doing in the council at County of Newell. And of course, it's not only the loss of topsoil, but where is it going, in terms of its impact on the infrastructure, impact downstream in terms of, getting into the drainage ditches and in our canals. So, it's something that, nobody likes this, nobody feels good about this, especially the farmers. And so the policy Todd had shared with me, and it's the County of Newell has a new policy handbook, and it spells out different ideas in terms of what would be control methods and things like cover crops and fall bedding potatoes, hairpinning residue in some instances, adding manure, leaving the surface rough, obviously no-till or leaving the stubble standing, and keeping cover on the ground. So it kind of makes some suggestions there with respect to what's reasonable at time of harvest. And we'll come back to this in the presentation. And then if the soil does start blowing, what do you do? And that's often the situation that we find ourselves in southern Alberta, and it's really, really tough. And we'll talk a little bit about what we can do. And none of these work particularly well once we get to that stage where the soil is starting to get away. Just to kind of kick things off, I wanted to talk about, when we talk about soil health or soil quality, and we think of the indicators, and I think probably the way that the thinking is involved around soil health and soil quality is that there's those 3 bubbles that kind of represent the biological. When we think about the biological, we're thinking of that soil food web, and we're not going to talk about that here today so much, but just these different tiers within our soil that contribute to the diversity and the life of the soil, and is such an integral part of that soil organic matter. Does so many great things, and I the farmers that I work with are really, really tuned into this in terms of the biological. We're going to kind of skip over that a little bit, or quite a bit here today. We're also going to not so much talk about the chemical aspects of soil quality or soil health, but things that you might have on your soil test, things like pH and organic matter, even organic matter content, the cation exchange capacity, and of course the nutrient content of the soils. A little bit more of a focus today is going to be on the physical attributes, and we're going to talk about texture as it relates to soil erosion, obviously, and then the really critical one when you think of soil erosion is this whole aspect of aggregate stability. And I know Frank will be probably talking a little bit about that when he talks about the results they had in the Vauxhall long-term rotation at Vauxhall. But aggregate stability is kind of a key that contributes to structure. And so we won't talk so much about compactness, but those physical aspects that kind of relate to our, I guess, building structure, but also just controlling erosion in terms of the influence of these things. When we talk about structure, there's that relationship between soil texture, soil aggregation or aggregate stability, as we'll define in a minute, and structure. And so texture is really that natural limitation of our specific soil type. And we'll come back to that in just a sec. But aggregation is the arrangement of those soil particles. So we have that specific soil type that we're starting with, and then we build soil structure initially through aggregation, and then the structure reflects the arrangement of those aggregates. So again, just in terms of the basics of some of these things that will influence erosion. And we know that not all of our soils are equal. Our clay soils, which we have a lot of our, almost all of our soils, all of our soils, because of glaciation, contain varying levels, clay, some more than others, but clay particles are so important because they're electrically charged surfaces, and they, our clay soils are much easier to aggregate and quickly form, reasonably good structure. Sandy soils, and if we contrast that against sandy soils, the larger particles, and those particles don't have an electrical charge, so we really rely on farming practices that contribute to soil organic matter, because it's the soil organic matter that's required to cement those particles together. And it's a slower process, admittedly, with sandier soils to try and build structure. Silty soils, silts are those small to medium-sized particles, and there's no electrical charge with those particles, so they don't naturally kind of stick together. They do form aggregates quite nicely and more quickly than sandier soils. So if we looked at our soils in your area there, those irrigated soils that are southeast of brooks, the Tilley and the Chin loams, or the Tilley and the Chin loam series, would be ranging in percent sand, 35 to 45%, 30 to 44% silt, 21 to 25% clay. And as you move down in those profiles, you do encounter probably below almost about 6 or 8 inches, you can get some really high silt levels. But right at the surface, you've got quite a bit of sand, but these are lovely soils, great irrigated soils. And they will, they aggregate quite nicely. So our sandy loams, just an example of some of the sandy loams, I work with Tony Bromelhouse down by Rainier, and those soils, the Rainier and the Bingville series, would be more sandy. So you've got your high levels of sand there, and a little bit of silt and very little clay. So these again are, when you think of erosion risk and aggregation, these are some of the soils that are a bit more at risk. Our sandier soils don't aggregate really easily. They don't form lumps. The loam soils are sort of intermediate to the clay soils. You can really get some pretty good aggregation and lump those soils up, which we'll talk about in a minute. But our loam soils, are sort of intermediate, where we often see that sort of nice granular aggregation in these loam soils. And if you had to pick a place for where Grandpa was going to homestead, you'd want to be kind of in the loam to clay loam soils. So aggregate stability is a key, we said, and just in the photo that you're seeing there, it really is that the ability, that stability of those aggregates is the ability for them to withstand breaking apart when subjected to the elements. In this case, we're running it through, we're putting some water over top of that with the sieve, and you can kind of see just how those aggregates kind of stick together. They're formed through physical, chemical, and biological activity. So basically, it's going to be influenced by texture. We've talked about that, and soil organic matter. Things like crop rotation, so sequences with perennials, and the background of lime is also really important with aggregation. So our calcareous, or our soils that we typically have that are predominantly our farmed soils or our cropped soils tend to have relatively high lime, and that lime helps to aggregate soil particles. And whereas sodium, for example, which we do have some sodic soils that we farm there, and of course those are tough to aggregate because the soil particles want to repel each other. The clay particles will actually repel each other. So tillage does reverse the natural process of aggregation. So whenever we're talking about our intensive rotations on irrigation, obviously tillage is most often, almost always going to be a significant part of that, whether we're growing root crops or even our big crops that, probably tillage is going to be a factor, and that does reverse those natural processes. So suffice to say, though, that soils with good aggregate stability do have good aeration and infiltration and tend to resist erosion. And we're going to talk a little bit about the freeze-thaw cycles, but it even does, good aggregated soils will kind of resist that kind of breaking apart that we get through the the winter forces that we have that cause us some problems. So just a picture from Colorado. Couldn't find the one that I had from some of my old slides, but just a good, moderate, and poor. On the right there, you see that massive. We would describe that as kind of a massive soil structure where there's virtually, no room for roots to penetrate, and then very, very good structure on the left there where we've got that crumbly soil texture, lots of good aeration, good root penetration. But so soil structure is important. Perennial crops, rotations with perennial crops help to build that soil structure. And, whether we're talking, alfalfa or timothy, timothy is really good. Timothy is not particularly deep rooted, but just the massive root structure that we get near the surface. And this helps to really, build soil structure if you've got a crop rotation or, sequence that includes perennials. I want to talk just in terms of setting things up here about this issue of freeze-thaw cycles and erosion. And, it's that progressive deterioration that we get through the winter with freezing and thawing, and the snow blasting as well that we get. These granulate, these snow ice particles that are just battering away at the aggregates that we've got and the surface roughness that we've got. And so we see that happen during the winter period. And, often fields with really good, roughness or, aggregates in the early winter can be highly erodible by mid to late winter. And that's very, very frustrating. And it's just a function of the weather that we tend to have down in the Chinook belt in southern Alberta. And of course, there's few options once those fields start to go. This is just an example, and this was a research trial that I had where we were out there in mid-October of 2020. And this is the Chin Loam just east of Tabor. And you can kind of see that this is pretty much in the same plot in mid-October, where you think, oh, that looks like pretty tough for the wind to get at that. We go out there in mid-March, and with the freeze thaws that we had in the early to mid-winter of 2021, how that's just broken down those aggregates, and that land was moving. And it's just, again, being prepared for that condition that we have with those, with our winters and our Chinooks and the freeze thaws that we experience. Now, a question that I was kind of, I thought, well, let me look at, let me explain this first. But we've got here, this is really a graph of the Brooks weather station showing peak winds. So we could show average winds, but here I'm showing the peak winds from November 15th to just a few days ago here in Brooks. And what I've done is I've put a line there at the 50 kilometer an hour, not to say that that's the magic number, but when we start getting over 40 or 50 kilometer an hour wind gusts, that's when the soil can really start moving, and we start to get those forces that, if the soil is open and susceptible, it'll start to move. And so you can kind of see the situation, I mean, that we've had here in the late winter. And I've added another component to the slide here, is that in my mind, the higher risk for erosion, because of what we just talked about in terms of the freeze-thaw cycles, is this period from early to mid-January through to the late late winter, early spring. Those are the times when we've kind of degraded the soil surface, if you will, from some of the freeze thaws. Now, not every winter, some winters we get the snow, it stays, it doesn't melt. And, but the further kind of southwest you go in southern Alberta, the bigger this issue is. And Frank will attest to that based on some of the past research that he's done. So was this winter and last winter, was it worse than normal? I thought I'd just go back and see that perhaps due to that combination of warmer temperatures that we had and some of these late winter winds, maybe it was a little bit worse this last couple of winters. And I thought, well, just, let's give ourselves a little bit of grace here, because there has been tough conditions. But if we go back to the 2015-16, and here, again, I'm just going to go through these really quick in terms of weather data. These are, again, peak winds beginning in mid-November, and here we're going right through to the middle of April. And you can kind of see how that late winter in 2015-16, yeah, we're getting those big winds coming after the middle of January. And, I can't remember how much erosion we had that winter. My mind isn't that good. 2016-17, again, similar. We're getting those big winds in the middle of the winter, but often those aren't the ones that kill us. It's that late winter. 2017-18, I know that was a year when we had some pretty good snowfall late in the winter, and we didn't have the problems that winter, even though we had some sort of midwinter wind. And 18-19, again, similar kind of situation. Skipping over these pretty quick. 19-20, I think the message, I guess, here is that we can expect those winds in the winter. We can expect them. The susceptibility, again, in a winter like 19-20 is that, those later in that winter period, we didn't have those excessive winds when we would be perhaps most at risk. But then last winter was a different story, wasn't it? I mean, we're missing some data here at the Brooks station, but, beginning in January, we had a couple of progressive freeze thaws, or, that was warming up, and we had those freeze thaws. And boy, we lost a lot of soil in southern Alberta, late last winter. And again, back to the situation here, I don't know. We definitely lost quite a bit of soil here in southern Alberta last, in the middle of January to February 15th. And we don't know what's going to happen between now and the end of winter. But having said that, moving kind of quickly then into talking about those post-harvest practices. And I put here, or post-wildfire, because this is getting more common, and I've been tied up in a number of situations where we get these fall wildfires on these drier years. And so practices that that can help. So cover crop where possible, and I think bean and early potato, and we'll look at some examples of that here in a few minutes. Creating that surface roughness is really often in our intensive production, low residue crops. It's about creating enough surface roughness to get through the winter. And it's, where we've got those loams and clay loams, can we chisel those and bring up clods? And is that going to get us through the winter? Hopefully. In those sandier soil types, if we don't have the cover, or going into winter, I mean, it's listing those areas. It's going out there, either adapting a cultivator on wide shank spacings, or for those that have the listers to be able to go out and enrich those soils. And then, of course, our fall bedding practices for potato, and we'll look at some innovations that there might be for the future there, but really it's keeping that kind of that surface roughness. Hairpinning straw on focal points is a possibility, and that's on Todd's list here for the Newell policy. And I mean, I always found wheat straw from a conventional combine, which is tough to find, it's the best. It tends to hold up the best. And then you're either hairpinning that with a disc machine, or with one of the specialized machines that has the cleats for putting that into the ground and anchoring it. Manure application, on a whole field at lower rates, but often you need a heavier rate, on those focal points. And we used to think 30 to 50 tons per acre. And so, of course, we have to be a little careful, because NRCB, doesn't like the much higher rates, but the more the merrier generally, and on focal points in particular. Just some side-by-sides on cover crops, just the dramatic difference that it can make. And this is in this example here, this is rye, and there was even some, I think, barley and fall rye that was broadcast before digging potatoes, and you can just see the difference it was making in mid to late winter. This is last spring on some. This is fall rye. This is an example on an early potato where the farmer has gone and prepared that potato land and then seeded fall rye. And this is just looking good when everyone else's land is blowing last winter. This was holding real nice. And you can kind of see in mid-March that rye is greening up and it's got a good anchor. And so this was silage. He silaged this, and he went in and seeded barley, and he got another silage crop. So that was kind of what he was doing. And just down the road from that, a winter wheat on bean that was holding real nice. And again, this you start to limit this option if you get much past the middle of September for seeding winter wheat. This is, I had to throw this in. This was from a presentation I did about 15 years ago at Newell, but this was a wheat cover crop with Jim Rex, a very young Jim Rex at Scandia in March. And this was wheat that was just planted in late August the previous year, and we were just admiring the guy who was going to go in and direct seed that. So we can do that with spring cereals. In terms of rules of thumb, seeding early for best cover, obviously. Spring cereals, they do grow more rapidly in the fall. And so if you're looking for cover, like what we saw with Jim standing out in that field, spring cereals, an oat or a barley in particular. Winter cereals, they have, and rye being better than trick, which is better than winter wheat in terms of the biomass it produces and probably the winter hardiness. But it's, you really need to, it's preferred for later planted cover crop, if you're after early September, because it kind of digs in the late winter. And often we'll still like to see a little bit of barley in there for fall cover. And seeding rates, the higher the better, especially for those later plantings, so if you're planting, if you're drilling that in versus, broadcast, incorporate, and irrigate up, a hoe is preferred to a disc, just to increase the surface roughness. And so some of the farmers that seed with discs, they've got that older hoe, hoe type style, or that shank type machine to plant these sites. And just a plug just on and the incredible structure that we can get from a fall cover crop. And in this case, this was a fall cover crop that was grazed. And you can just see those roots here. We're looking at that in late April of the following year. Just an incredible biomass below ground. And here's another one here. This was rye seeded on pea stubble in the fall, and just the tremendous forming aggregates, producing, feeding some earthworms. But yeah, so I think we kind of know that anytime we can have a living root in the ground, that's going to improve the soil. It's going to help hold the soil. And these, these covers don't always get planted in time, or we get into a fall, let's say the fall of 2019 when, it started, we got that big snow in the middle of, to late September, and the covers just never got rolling. And so we really relied on very, very minimal cover from cover crops in that winter of, spring of 2020. And it was just because, we couldn't get anything started in the fall. We get into those situations where we need to go in and do emergency control. And I'm not going to really talk much about this, but there's a really good fact sheet. And I know this would be probably the basis for some of what Todd is, have in their policy. And you just, again, you hate to see this, but we're out there trying to roughen up the soil, in this case, northeast of Lethbridge here, where somebody's been out and they've gone every second pass on the first go. And then when it started going again, they're out there doing, again, every second pass again, just to try and keep it rough, keep it from blowing. And it's a very frustrating thing. And sometimes if the soil is frozen a little bit, you can, get in there with wider shanks and pull up some of those frozen lumps, and it does an even better job. Won't go through this table in the interest of time, but it's in the fact sheet. It sort of is sort of the, a lot of this is kind of a no-brainer, but, for different types of soil, sandier soils and loamier soils, some of the options that are there. And again, none of these are great, especially if you get into those long periods of time that you have to keep that soil stabilized, because the snow just keeps and the wind just keeps hammering away at these soils. Just a little bit of a plug for some of the guys that are trying to make these systems work, where like strip tillage with row crops. You can actually, in this particular slide, you can see we've actually been in the fall here on this particular field, and we've banded our fertilizer down 3.5 inches in those zones, and they've kind of filled in a little bit. Now we're planting on top of those zones, and this is not new technology by any stretch. And strip tillage is, reasonably common and will become more common in southern Alberta. But I think it's something we should be thinking about and looking at and testing. And this was that field of sugar beets as it was coming along, in the spring. And Frank and some of his colleagues at Lethbridge have done a lot of work with beets, and Rogers or Atlantic Inc. has done a lot of work on sugar beets. There's some new good research starting. Dr. Jonathan Nielsen, Faghand at Lethbridge, he's looking at conservation practices for some of our higher intensity, particularly the low residue situations and rotations, and he's especially focused on potato production. And he presented a bit of that last week at the Farming Smarter workshop, and I won't have a chance to get into that, but some really novel approaches that he's looking at. Farming Smarter is doing some work, several projects planned to look a bit more at the strip tillage and cover crops for irrigated rotations, and hoping that they'll be funded for those, and appreciate the support that some of you farmers have provided to Farming Smarter. I'll just put in a plug here, just wrapping up here, Todd, but Perry Farms at Chin, they've been trying some innovative things with their potato beds. I mean, look at that cover crop on the potato beds, and they're seeding into that in the spring. And so this is right off their website. If you want to, you have to kind of give your head a shake, but this would be some of the really neat things that they're doing down, at Perry Farms. And they haven't got it all figured out, but some really good results with some of the things that they're trying. So yeah, back to the policy. The obvious thing is to try and build soil structure, build good aggregate stability, and avoid those situations where you have to go out and take action. But we just recognize the challenges with our intensive rotations. We also know that at times even what we've been able to do hasn't worked, and so we need to get out there. So there are practices that we can use, and Todd or some of the agronomists and neighbors can help you with those. And so with that, I hope, and I haven't gone too far over time, Todd, but I'll turn it back to you.
That's perfect, Rob. Appreciate that. I think if it's okay with everybody, we will hold off on any questions we may have, and allow Dr. Frank to give us an update on some of their learnings from their Vauxhall study, and pardon me, and then we will have a few moments for questions after that.
Okay, thanks very much, Todd. I'm just going to share my screen here. Yeah, so thanks, Todd, for inviting me to speak this afternoon. Yeah, so I'm going to talk actually about an irrigated rotation study that we did at Vauxhall from 2000 to 2011. So I think there's still some merit in talking about this older rotation study here. So just see, can I go back up here? Okay. So I guess just going back in time a little bit as to why we got this study off the ground in the first place. So we're going back to 1999, the last century. But anyway, there was a lot of talk back then in the late 90s about starting a new rotation study. Basically, the impetus was the expansion of the acreages of processing potato, sugar beet, and dry bean in the late 90s in southern Alberta. And McChain Foods and Lamb Weston had just recently opened new processing plants for potato, which meant there were new, I guess, potato growers coming into the equation. There was a squeeze on the existing land base of irrigated land, and there was a lot of questions swirling about, you know, how do we ensure that increased production on irrigated land is going to be sustainable? How do we maintain soil quality? And lo and behold, it's like, well, let's start a rotation study. So we did, and it ran for 12 years, like I mentioned, 2000 to 2011, so 12 growing seasons. So I guess the question is now, like, why do we care about this in 2022? And I think just from what Rob has told us at the previous presentation, there's still a lot of stuff happening in terms of wind erosion and effects on soil quality that was happening back in the late 90s when this experiment got off the ground. So some things haven't actually changed that much. So I think we can still learn some lessons from this particular rotation study. So as I mentioned, the acreages of some of the irrigated crops were increasing. You can see as we move from that left-hand side, the blue part of the graph, onto the white part, you can see right around 2000 was when a lot of these acreages, there was quite substantial jumps in acreages of these three crops from about 96 to about 2000. So the timing was good in terms of starting up this rotation study.
Sorry to barge in on you, Frank. Your slides are not moving for us.
Oh, are they not? Okay.
Frank, I think you might be sharing. Might be sharing one screen versus the other, not the one that has the slides on it.
Okay. So what are you seeing? Just the title slide?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh shoot. Okay, stop sharing. Sorry about that. Let's try this again. What are you seeing now?
Back in 1999.
Yeah, okay. That's the one I just, looks like it's going through now, I think.
Perfect.
Yeah, and then this is a graph that I mentioned about the crop acreages, all showing an increase right around the time we began the study in 2000. And now onto wind erosion, and I know Rob has talked about this. So just to, I guess, reiterate, you know, the irrigated rotations, they often clear potato, sugar beet, and dry bean. And the thing about all of these crops is that they produce very little residue. So they don't return a lot of residue to the soil. Unlike forages that Rob mentioned, cereals, they do a much better job of protecting the surface by returning residue to the soil. And then being root crops, potato and sugar beet, they don't really fit into a conservation tillage scenario because there's so much soil disturbance done to basically get the crops out of the ground, potato and sugar beet in the fall, that you can't really call that tiller. There's so much soil disturbance. So with wind erosion, you know, what we're seeing generally now is that irrigated land, the risk is definitely higher than on dry land. With dry land, you know, basically so much of that land is under some form of conservation tillage now. Fallow has essentially disappeared on dry land, so our wind erosion issues on dry land are not what they once were. Whereas irrigated land, we're still seeing some wind erosion, as Rob mentioned. And with that, you know, the degradation of soil quality, obviously the loss of organic matter. Once that topside is lost, it's very difficult to restore that land to its original productivity. So this study, the Vauxhall irrigated rotation study, a lot of talk about rotation in the late 90s, like I mentioned. And we had several meetings back then with 25 people, and representatives from, you know, PGA, Alberta Sugar Beet Growers, Alberta Pulse Growers, Rogers Sugar, and back then we still had PFRA as part of Ag Canada and Alberta Ag. So we basically came to a consensus with all these people what sort of a study that we wanted to get up and running at Vauxhall. So the biggest challenge, I guess, was to select the crops. There's a lot of crops to choose from when it comes to irrigated cropping. Compared to dry land, there's a way bigger diversity of crops you can grow under irrigation. So basically we had to nail down you know, the main crops, which we did. And, you know, we didn't put one. Basically we came up with potato, dry beet, sugar beet, and soft wheat. So they were in all the rotations, and then we had timothy and oat in a longer 6-year rotation. And we knew that we wanted to compare conventional and conservation practices, and I'll talk about those a bit later. And located at Vauxhall, that's a brown Chernism, and the surface AP horizon is a sandy loam soil. So this is the Vauxhall substation at AFC Vauxhall. You can see there the golf course. For those of you who know Vauxhall, the golf course is just directly west of the research station there. So our objectives to devise crop sequences and tillage management for irrigated land that optimize crop response, reduce soil erosion, enhance soil quality, ensure long-term sustainability, while at the same time minimizing weed and disease problems. So they were the objectives back in 1999. And you'll notice that the term soil health wasn't sort of around at that point. It kind of was, but nobody really called it soil health. I guess we were calling it soil quality back then. And that has really changed since back in 1999. And you hear people talk about soil health all the time now, which is great. And you know, the question arises, would we have the same objectives in 2022? And when you look at those 3 objectives, I'm not sure you would change much if you were starting this study 23 years later. We're still, you know, trying to basically achieve the same thing when we manage our soil. So just to outline the various rotations that we looked at over the 12 years, we had continuous wheat in there, which, you know, it's not a rotation per se, but it was in there as a baseline. And then we had 2 3-year rotations, so potato, dry bean, and wheat, and managed conventionally and managed with conservation practices. I'll outline the conservation practices later. And then we had a paired set of 4-year rotations, so potato, soft wheat, sugar beet, and dry bean. And again, one was conventional and one was conservation. And then we had a 5-year rotation, which is potato, wheat, sugar beet, wheat, dry bean. So basically 2 cereal crops interspersed with the 3 row crops. And lastly, we had a 6-year rotation, so potato, oats, taken off as green feed in July, seeded to Timothy in late August, and then 2 full years of Timothy production, followed by sugar beets and dry bean. And both these 5 and 6 year rotations were managed with the conservation practices. So
hey, Frank,
yeah.
I was just gonna say, I don't know if, Todd, are you still back on the air photo slide?
I am, yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
so we got stuck.
Sorry,
on slide
guys.
7
Sorry,
or 3. Yeah.
I fixed it. It seems there's a problem when I'm putting it into show mode. Sorry,
There
I'll
you
go
go.
back. Sorry about that.
No,
Should
I
have
think
stopped me earlier. I just flicked it over into slideshow mode, and it seems to be losing the screen when I did that. Can you see the objective slide now?
yes.
Okay. And then we're going through the different rotations that I talked about. So the 3-year conventional and conservation, and then the 4-year conventional and conservation, the 5-year conservation, and the 6-year conservation. And then I was getting ready to outline the conservation practices used over 12 years. So I won't go back into this. I had animation here, but I better not use that because it seems like it's not going to work. So basically the 4 practices were all employed on the conservation rotations as a bundle. So basically there was compost beef cattle manure applied as a substitute for inorganic fertilizer. So there was rates of 28 to 42 tons per hectare every 3 to 6 years, depending on the length of the rotation. The entry point for compost was always in the fall before potato. And where we applied compost, we did not apply phosphorus fertilizer for our following potato crop. And at the same time, we cut back our nitrogen for potatoes to 33% of what it would be on the conventional potato. So basically, we took credit for the nutrients in that compost. We also grew cover crops where possible in the rotation. So we did start out with oat and fall rye, but we subsequently dropped oat as a cover crop because it didn't perform very well. We had trouble getting establishment in the fall. So we switched entirely to fall rye as our cover crop choice, but that went to the end of the rotation. And then for dry bean, we had narrow row, straight cut dry bean. So there was some interest back then, in 2000. There was a couple of growers using this system for dry bean. So we went with that, and then we compared it with their conventional wide row, 60 centimeter wide rows undercut. And then reduced tillage or direct seeding where possible. So for example, for conventional potato, it was still moldboard ploughing back then. And for conservation potato, we used a dammer diker instead. So like I say, these 4 practices were all used as a bundle on the conservation rotations. So some results from the study. We had quite a few actually plot tours and field days and stuff like that during the study. So this photograph was taken at one of those. So let's look at the 4 main crops in the study in terms of what our yields look like. The first question that people have is, well, you're doing all this great stuff for the soil. So but how does that affect my bottom line in terms of crop yield? So this is looking at potato first of all. And what I'm showing here, just to sort of whittle things down, distill the results down a bit, it's the average marketable tuber yield for the 12 growing seasons. So with this experiment, I mean, the early years can be looked upon as establishment years. So it takes a little bit of time before you actually get into, you know, nailing down the study and getting things sort of falling into place, if you will. So, you know, there's a lot of year-to-year variation. So what this average does, it sort of tries and distills the results down into just a, you know, a one picture that you can sort of, you know, look at and try and figure out what was happening. So you can see there that our 3-year conventional rotation, so that's potato, dry beans, wheat, averaged 37.6 tons per hectare marketable tuber yield. And those letters across the top are basically the statistical analysis. So, you know, this one was significantly higher, the 5-year conservation rotation. And the 3-year conservation rotation was significantly higher than the 3-year conventional one by about 10%. So on average over the 12 years, we could improve our yield of potato by 10% by adopting these conservation practices in that tighter 3-year potato, bean, wheat rotation. And by switching to a 5-year rotation for potato, we could actually increase your yield by 18% compared to that 3-year conventional one, which is essentially our baseline, if you will, for potato in the trial. So that's substantial, an 18% increase in marketable tuber yield, averaged over 12 years. And looking at the 3-year conservation versus the 4-year conventional, there is no difference between those two. So basically, by stretching out the potato from 1 year and 3 to 1 year and 4, the frequency of potato 1 year and 4, we could get an equivalent yield to the 3-year rotation for potato with those bundled conservation practices that I talked about earlier. So that sort of shows you, the effect of frequency. And often there's a temptation to tighten up our rotations, to maybe grow some of the higher paying crops more often to increase their frequency. And this shows that, if you look at the 3-year conventional versus the 4-year conventional, there is still about a 10% yield difference there once you stretch it out to 1 year potato and 4 versus 1 and 3. And 4-year conventional, 4-year conservation, no difference between those two. So showing again that the longer the rotation or the lower frequency of potato, whether you adopt conservation practices or not, you get the same yield on that particular one, that comparison. Let's look at dry bean, and you'll see first of all that all those letters are the same. You'll see all those A's across the top there, and their yields are all quite close. There's a little bit of a dip here in this 5-year one, the conservation one, and that's actually where we did some direct seeding of dry bean into a fall rye burn-off. So that did lower yield, but not significantly, as you'll notice. So the main, I think, take-home point of this one was that you can switch to a narrow row dry bean system and basically not see a decline in yield compared to our traditional wide row system. I'm not sure where it's at now in terms of adoption, but that narrow row system, I don't think it's really been widely adopted for dry bean. I think most beans are still grown under conventional wide row production. So in terms of the soil conservation approach, that narrow row system does make a difference in terms of soil cover. And what the experiment shows is it didn't really affect your yield here compared to a traditional system. Sugar beet, the other the root crop in the rotation, And it didn't appear in the 3-year rotations because the Rogers Sugar just give contracts for sugar beet grown in 4-year or higher rotations. So basically you'll see there that the 4-year conventional one, so no conservation practices there, had a significantly lower yield than the other 3 that did have conservation practices. So 11% higher roughly with 4-year and 5-year sugar beet grown under conservation practices, and 8% higher on the 6-year rotation with sugar beet. And I should say that it's not the average of the 12 years, it's actually the average of the last 6. So in the first 6 we didn't see a lot happening with sugar beet, and it really took till the second half of the study for these differences to emerge. So I think that shows the benefits of running these experiments for as long as we can. So if we'd finished after 6 years, we would have said, well, there's no real effect on sugar beet yields, but that wasn't true when we extended it out to 12 years. We did see the benefit of conservation practices happening for sugar beet in the latter half of the study. And basically extractable sugar yield, which is what the growers get paid for, you see essentially 7 to 8% increase in extractable sugar yield on the conservation rotations versus the 4-year conventional. Soft wheat, you see basically apart from the continuous wheat, there wasn't a lot of difference in wheat yields on the other rotation treatments. So basically continuous wheat, and I mean we know that's kind of a no-brainer. Basically it was about 75% of the yield of wheat grown in any other type of rotation. So the soft wheat actually, I think, was the least responsive crop of the 4 main crops to rotation, in that there were very few differences in soft wheat yield. Looking at soil organic carbon, so this is at the end of the study in 2011, and we've got 2 pools of carbon here. We've got a fine pool and a particulate pool. So this fine pool is the older, larger pool of organic matter akin to humus, and you can see here these red colors are essentially the same on all rotations. But then this particulate organic matter, organic carbon, is the biologically and chemically active component. So basically it's the easily decomposable pool of soil organic matter, and a lot of that would be the organic matter that was added in the compost, but also the organic matter from reduced tillage, from the cover crops as well. And so you can see that really that's driving, these green bars are the ones that are driving the differences in the rotations. And you can see that the conventional ones, 3-conv and 4-conv, are significantly lower in terms of soil organic carbon in the surface soil than the conservation ones. And this is related to improved soil structure that Rob talked about, and there's a very strong linkage between soil organic carbon and aggregate stability. They tend to go hand in hand. Basically, the higher the organic carbon, the better or the more stable your aggregates are, which does have an impact on reducing your erosion risk. So these are the changes in soil organic carbon over time, and you can see this one here is green circled 3-conv, so 3-year conventional rotation. It was actually losing organic carbon. If we fit a regression line to those points, it was losing about 1/4 ton per hectare per year of soil organic carbon, where we made no effort to basically build up that soil. We were managing it without any kind of conservation practices. The 3-year conservation one, where over the 12 years we added 107 tons per hectare of compost, basically it was fairly similar to the continuous wheat in terms of organic carbon. We didn't see an upward trend on the 3-year conservation rotation over time. However, we did see an upward trend on the 4-year conservation rotation, positive linear. So it was gaining 0.3 tons per hectare per year of soil organic carbon. And cumulatively, it got 116 tons per hectare of compost over the 12 years. So we did see an impact on soil organic carbon, mainly due to that compost application. And in the 5-year one, we had a higher rate of cumulative addition of compost, 154, and you can see an even bigger bump, a steeper slope, an upward trend on that 5-year conservation rotation. So it was gaining close to half a ton, so 0.48 tons per hectare per year of soil organic carbon in the top. This is the top 30 centimeters of soil. So just to wrap it up here, in terms of, we did look at surface residue cover, and that's a very important component of reducing wind erosion risk. If we can try and maintain our soil cover, as Rob mentioned, you know, either through managing our residue from previous crops or growing cover crops to improve that residue cover. So basically, 30% residue cover is considered a threshold for wind erosion risk. And this is a rule of thumb. So basically, you need that minimum amount of surface, 30% of the surface area with residue on it to, you know, cut back on your erosion risk. And once you get less than 30%, you're, you know, running the risk of using topsoil. So basically every spring we measured surface cover on these plots. So the previous crop and goes here from highest to lowest. First year Timothy, you know, 100% cover. Oat Timothy 76%, wheat 34%. Second year Timothy, so this had been actually worked up in the fall, and then I was getting ready to plant sugar beet into it. It was only 12%. And then a previous crop of dry bean, 10%, so sugar beet, potato. The dry bean wide row was the lowest, at only 4% cover. So once you get into these row crops, you can see that we're way down there in terms of surface cover. We're down less than 10%. So these surfaces are considered at high erosion risk. And just another slide here on the left, you know, what happens if we add a fall rye cover crop? So in this case, the previous crop was potato. We planted fall rye on September 25th, and then we let it go to May 11 the following spring, and that gave us a 58% cover in the spring when we measured that. If we didn't let it grow as late, so this one was April 25th, we had a 30% cover, and here's dry bean and fall rye, and it had a 28% cover. So that shows the sort of cumulative effect of adding a fall rye cover crop to push these surface cover percentages above that 30% threshold. So in terms of summing up then, basically irrigated rotations without any kind of soil building management run the risk of reduced yield. For example, that 3-year conventional potato rotation, the reduced yield that we found there, and diminished soil quality. And I didn't mention, I should have mentioned earlier, on the potato slide, we did see some potato early dying syndrome show up on that 3-year conventional rotation, and whereas the incident rates of PED were lower on the 3-year conservation rotation. So there was something going on there, but we think it was related to the compost application, which decreased the susceptibility of the potato crop to early dying. So basically the vast majority of soil quality indicators responded to conservation management practices. You know, we should consider replenishing soil organic matter on irrigated land with composted manure, or even, you know, fresh manure if we can have access to it. While all conservation rotations improve soil quality, I think the 5 cons often had the highest level of soil quality based on numerous indicators, and we had a lot more indicators. Newton Lepuy, the soil microbiologist at Lethbridge, did a whole slew of microbiological indicators as well, looking at different microbial community populations, and a lot of them pointed to, you know, first of all, higher soil quality or soil health under conservation management, and the 5 conservation in particular rotation was often the top performer in terms of a lot of these parameters that Newton measured. Potato and sugar beet were the most responsive crops to conservation management based on our overall results. Dry bean and wheat were generally less responsive. I think, I'd like to maybe reiterate, when we're choosing crops for irrigated rotations, don't forget about cereals and forages. Don't fall into, maybe being tempted to squeeze those out of your rotations, because we really are relying on those for returning carbon and providing cover in these irrigated rotations. So with that, I'll wrap it up, and thanks for your time this afternoon.
That was great, Frank. Thank you for your time. It's an impressive amount of data that I imagine you guys had to go through for all of that. But I thought it was some good results.
Yeah, we got, like I say, we ran for 12 years, Todd, and I think that's, we really have to, I think that's almost a minimum for this type of work. And I hear now, lots of talk about maybe looking at starting up some more rotation work on irrigated land. But this is a body of work, and it's actually all published in the literature. We have about 20 research publications on every aspect of it. I didn't even talk about some of the measurements. We measured soil water as well in the soil profile under all those crops. And, so there was some economic work done as well by an ag economist. So I think the beauty about these trials is once they're set up and established, there's a lot of people that can come in and essentially piggyback on them, and you can get an awful lot of information out of them if you bring in a lot of different research disciplines.
That's fantastic. This sounds like a whole seminar series for you, Frank. You might be doing this long after you retire now.
I don't know. Yeah, thanks, Todd.
All right, well, we did have a couple questions in the chat that I thought if Rob was still around, we could maybe touch on these. I'm not sure exactly who's going to be best to answer, but we'll leave that open to you guys. So is oats a good cover crop in southern Alberta? And how much frost can fall-seeded oats, barley, and spring wheat, handle before it's killed?
So just on that, the last part of that question there, Todd, they'll keep growing quite late into the fall. And a lot of times what happens is that because they're planted a little bit later, that growing point is below the surface, so it'll keep, sometimes that top growth will freeze off, but they'll keep coming. And but I mean, you can kind of figure sort of, some falls where you're going to, still have some biomass produced in, with spring cereals, into late October, early November. Winter cereals will just keep growing, often at those cooler temperatures, and they'll survive some of the frost. Spring wheat survives a bit more frost than barley and oats, but a researcher told me one time that our spring wheats, our CPS and our hard red or our CWRS wheats, they have as much winter hardiness as a Kansas winter wheat, and I'm not sure how true that is, but you do see the winter wheats will just keep going, and sometimes over winter when you get these mild winters. But and so oats is a good. Oats just grows quite nicely at cooler temperatures, and it produces almost as much biomass as a barley, and probably that higher lignin content in the oat. It survives the snow blasting in the winter a bit better, so if you can get some oat biomass, it'll survive a bit better through the winter, has been my experience, than barley, which tends to be a bit more fragile. So.
It is an interesting question because we often plug barley as a natural to seed in for cover crops, but not oats. It was a good question.
Yeah, no, it's a tradition. Everyone's got the barley on hand, but where do you get the oats? I know, like if you have an issue with volunteer, oats are a lot nicer to work with sometimes. That's
gotcha.
Cool. Yeah.
Oh, that's a good point. And then another question to you, Frank. Where would a person find the publications from the rotation study?
I have them all actually. So if anybody wants them, just send me an email or go through you, Todd, and I can send them on. Yeah,
that's very easy. That I'll maybe get you two in touch with each other then, Frank, and everybody can do some learning.
I'll type my email address into the chat there.
Perfect. One of the when we do have soil erosion events here locally, I end up talking to a lot of producers, and I really enjoy the conversations. And one of the comments that I've heard before is after a heavy tillage crop, an intense crop, it takes 5 to 10 years to build that soil structure back up. Is that something that is a measurable number, or is that just something that maybe people have noted on the ground? Do you know that, maybe Rob? Rob looks very concerned, but I don't believe he's connected to us anymore.
So I flipped off my video because I was getting my signal was starting to go fade there. But Frank, do you want to handle that? And I can.
So you're talking about like a harvest operation of potato or sugar beet, Todd?
Maybe so. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, especially I think sugar beet in particular, because it can be run into later in the fall than potato, and sometimes you can have quite wet conditions if we have a wet fall, or so there can be a lot of soil compaction with that heavy equipment, and I think it's all related to our soil organic matter. If our soils are inherently low in soil organic matter, it's going to take longer for them to bounce back, so they're less resilient. You hear a lot about soil resilience these days, and that's that sort of bounce back effect. So when you disturb them or do something bad to them, let's say some kind of bad management, how long does it take them to bounce back? And that's soil resilience that we hear about lots these days. So I think some soils that are maybe just of poor structure to begin with, or inherently degraded, or maybe they've had some erosion in the past, they're going to have lower soil resilience, and they may not bounce back as quickly from, say, compaction or from a lot of heavy soil disturbance that we get from potato or sugar beet harvest operations.
Very nice. Thanks, Frank. The other question I had, we have a lot of vertical tillage machines that have kind of showed up on the landscape now. I was wondering, when we see those kind of machines running in the fall, is that kind of a good thing, a bad thing? I mean, it's probably good to be ready for the spring, but is it bad in the sense of breaking that soil structure down for wind erosion?
Well, I know I work with a couple of farmers that they actually have the speed discs, so the vertical, and a lot of times they're just parked, in the fall because of the risk. But they can all, they can obviously be be set to, you know, just size the residue. But if we're trying to bury residue, like depending on the machine and how it's set, if you're, you know, going fast and trying to bury residue, they're pretty effective, and that's definitely, you know, the main thing is that whatever, if you're going into really, really heavy residue stubble, I know I've seen some guys, and, you know, they're getting probably, you know, 50%, you know, they're burying 50% of the residue. In a situation like that, as Frank mentioned, with the land prep with a big soft wheat crop, you know, or a big cereal crop of any kind, a lot of times, you know, there's still lots of residue cover there. The caution comes when, you know, you're further preparing that land than, you know, for a crop the next spring, and then, you know, you have, you know, largely, you know, broken up, you know, your aggregates, and they're really good at, they've got those rolling baskets in behind, it leaves it nice and level. And so we had, I know the one agronomist that got fired, whose name I won't mention, in the Claresholm area, he suggested to one of the farmers that he should get one of those. And he filled the ditches and the fences that winter, and the agronomist was out of a job. So, you know, as an agronomist, I would never recommend that, you know, on dry land particularly, but there are situations and instances where it's probably, you know, a tool that could be used on irrigation with heavy cover, where you're trying to manage that. You know, I'd prefer it to plowing.
I think they are being used on dry land further north, Rob, are they?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Well, that's very nice. Well, thank you very much, guys. I appreciate it. If nobody has muted mics anymore, so if anybody has a question, feel free to ask. I just want to, you know, publicly thank you guys for all of that wonderful information. I know I always appreciate learning a little bit more, and definitely picked up some things today. So thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, happy to help.